Once the door was closed and Twitch had carefully removed the bag full of explosives from Fumble's head, we looked around our new shuttle. The room where we'd fought the fish heads had just been a moderately roomy troop compartment. Nothing interesting in there. This room was definitely some sort of command center. It wasn't filled with Vox units, cogitators, and random uninsulated wires like an Imperial command center, but the hollow thingy displaying a map of the station in the middle of the room was a dead giveaway. Despite its tasteful decor and abundant air supply, the command room made us uneasy. It had a short hallway leading to the shuttle's cockpit, but none of us saw any hatches connected to the station. In fact, the only exit we'd seen was the one on the rear, and it hadn't been connected to anything. The question of how the Xenos got aboard the station, and which direction they'd be coming from if they tried to take their shuttle back, hung in the air like a wet fart in a tank. Hard to ignore and holding the potential to become a serious problem. From the elegant but rather uncomfortable chair he'd found near the map, Sarge reminded everyone about how the Xenos were supposed to use teleporting webs to get around. A brief search of the shuttle didn't turn up anything that looked like a teleportarium or was particularly web-shaped. The closest we got was a Xenos rune that looked sort of like a spider. Twitch put a mine on it just to be safe, then put a mine on everything else just to be safer. None of us stopped him. It was really the only defensive option we could think of. While Twitch saw to the perimeter, Tink got to work on figuring out how to fly our new piece of loot. Amy checked in with the other teams, and Nubby called Doc for some medical advice. Sarge later complained bitterly about how many tries it had taken to relocate his shoulders, but neither Nubby nor Fumbles had any medical training, and there was a lot of distortion on the comm channel. Anyway, the way he kept yelling was very distracting, and the second one only took 2 tries, so all his whining wasn't really justified. After the little medical procedure was finished, a quick council of war was held. Amy reported that the other teams were just killing a lot of servitors, not making any real progress towards finding useful intel. Jim followed that up with a report that the tech priests hadn't given any new orders, but claimed they were very interested in our shuttle. Based on all that, Sarge's vague plan was for us to call off the station part of the mission before anyone did something crazy, and fly the Eldar shuttle back to the occurrence border. From there, the Adepts, and possibly the Cog Boys, could search it for clues or whatever. The only real problem with this plan was that, compared to Imperial, or Tau systems for that matter, Eldar tech was almost impossible to understand. Tink was working hard and kept claiming that he'd nearly figured it out, but so far he'd only managed to turn the lights on and off. While Tink tinkered and occasionally asked for advice from Jim and old Bill, the rest of us kept busy. Amy watched the perimeter with Twitch, Sarge poked at the holomap, and Nubby and Fumbles were assigned prisoner duty. Prisoner in this case meant the severed Xenos torso. They taped the thing to the wall and, at Twitch's request, drew a face on its blank head so it didn't look so creepy. At Nubby's urging, Fumbles was adding some embellishments to their artwork, when a section of wall slid outwards and a tall, lithe, and familiar-looking Xenos appeared out of thin air. The Eldar warlock scanned the room, then began to say something. He was immediately interrupted by Twitch shouting that a hostile had breached the perimeter and raising his lasgun. The Xenos tried to resume speaking, only to be interrupted again as Twitch asked for permission to fire. Sarge, who'd nodded off, jerked awake just in time to hear the frustrated Eldar snap.
"Foolish Mon Kai, you can't shoot me, I'm a
Then Twitch got tired of waiting and opened up on full auto. There are times when an inquisitorial agent, military commander, or imperial diplomat will negotiate with one of the hated Xenos and discover that they really aren't all that bad. Then they wind up working together to fight some common foe, and a sort of polite but distant working relationship based on mutual respect is formed. This was not one of those times. It took the Warlock about 5 tries to finish saying hologram. Twitch kept shooting him every time he started talking. When the demolitions trooper finally ran out of ammo, the incredibly frustrated Eldar exploded into a lecture on how holograms work and why it was pointless to shoot them. He was interrupted halfway through as Nubby shot him, turned towards Sarge, and reported that the Xenos appears to be some sort of hologram. I don't think we can shoot him. The Eldar swore in its fancy language and asked Sarge to control his ape creature, whereupon Twitch finished reloading and shot him again, while Nubby loudly told Sarge that the Xenos was getting pissy. Things only went downhill from there. The Warlock was an arrogant bastard. He tried to order us around, but none of us had even the slightest intention of returning to our wretched vessel, or leaving matters beyond our comprehension to our betters. The diplomatic breakdown was total. On our side of the table, Amy had a serious axe to grind. Nubby was just Nubby. Sarge's shoulders hurt like a bitch, and everyone else just didn't give a shit. As for the Warlock, he loudly declared us to be idiot children playing with deadly weapons, both personally and as a race. The Eldar had probably intended to either use his moral superiority to get us to leave his ship, or cut some sort of deal with us. The problem was that he kept getting bogged down in pointless arguments, petty insults, and fits of frustrated anger. Everyone, even Fumbles, was doing something that might as well have been scientifically designed to outrage the prissy Xenos. To start with, Tink didn't even try to hide the fact that he was stealing the Eldar's shuttle, and occasionally asked him what a specific button did. Amy only spoke when she'd thought of something particularly scathing to say to him, and while Twitch eventually stopped shooting the hologram, he'd occasionally interrupt the Warlock to insert his own, rather unique theories into the conversation. Fumbles, who was admittedly acting on Nubby's orders, doodled on the captive fish-headed Xenos. This caused a surprising amount of anger in the Warlock, despite how good the mustache and monocle he drew looked. All that was relatively minor compared to Nubby and Sarge, though. Nubby, for reasons beyond all logic, had appointed himself as the Warlock's translator. He shouted down or shot the holographic Xenos at the end of almost every sentence, then relayed his personal interpretation to Sarge. Our fearless leader took an evil delight in how much this annoyed the Eldar, and started only responding to Nubby's translations. It was childish, antagonistic, incredibly unprofessional, and all according to a plan so devious that none of us even realized we were part of it. Well, at least Sarge claimed it was his plan afterwards, and no one was in any position to argue with the results. In his most cunning of minds, Sarge figured out that the Warlock had us incredibly outclassed when it came to diplomacy. The only person on our team that stood even a chance of holding their own was the old diplomat adept back on the ship. But with the cogboys monitoring the comms, bringing him in was out of the question. Therefore, the only way we could possibly come out ahead in a negotiation with an Eldar, who probably had hundreds of years' experience talking circles around Inquisitors and the like, was to drag him down to our level. Now, the brilliance of Sarge's plan didn't end there. In addition to keeping the Eldar off balance, the behavior of the more eccentric members of our squad acted as a time-buying distraction for both Tink and the other teams. Every second the Warlock spent screaming at us in incoherent rage was a second where he wasn't leading an attack on our shuttle or sniping anyone in the station. Admittedly, neither group was actually accomplishing anything useful with that time. Tink had found 13 different controls for the shuttle's lights, and last we heard the other teams, they were still killing endless waves of servitors. But they did have it. The incredibly uncivil discussion eventually rolled around to how stupid humanity's fascination with Archaeotech was. Our race's suicidal persistence in trying to keep the current peace from its owners was going to wind up gutting the entire sector's ability to fight off the next wave of Tyranids. On top of that, if we somehow managed to keep it, we'd inevitably wind up destroying ourselves with it. Any sane race would have let the Necrons have it, or at least dropped it on some Orc or Tyranid world that no one would miss. Sarge perked up at this piece of actual useful information. Then, when Nubby suggested his cunning new idea to drop the Archaeotech on some Orc or Tyranid world that no one would miss, Sarge agreed that it was a good one. The Eldar paused mid-rant to boggle. The incredulous Warlock asked if we were serious. Sensing that the time was right, Sarge told Nubby to shut up and promised that he was super serious. We didn't want to use the Archaeotech. We didn't want to study the Archaeotech. And we certainly didn't want to fight Necron's Emperor help us for the Archaeotech. As far as any of us was concerned, the metal bastards could have the thing. The Eldar sputtered, then asked about 15 different questions, most of which he answered himself. We were obviously too stupid to lie, and we must have already known what the Archaeotech was. Otherwise, how'd we come to the system? Furthermore, despite our appearance and behavior, we were obviously the ones in charge of the mission. After all, our team was the one in his shuttle, as opposed to fighting servitors on the station. No one corrected these assumptions. The only real question the Eldar had for us was why we wanted the Archaeotech destroyed. According to him, the 5 other Inquisitors and Magi he'd encountered, then killed, had all lusted after the device like it was mankind's salvation. Sarge nonchalantly suggested that we were just smarter than them. The Warlock shot a pointed look at Nubby, who had a finger jammed up to the second joint in his nostrils. Then back at Sarge. Our fearless leader shrugged and adjusted that to less ambitious than them. Before anyone else could say anything to push the Warlock back from confused to furious, Sarge made his move. He pointed out how we only wanted to prevent any more planets being wiped out. We agreed with the Eldar. The Archaeotech either needed to be destroyed, turned over to the Necrons, or sent out of Imperial space. So, he should just tell us where it was going next and we'd handle the rest. There'd be no working together bullshit. We'd leave as soon as we had our directions. And he'd never have to talk to us again. The Warlock started to say something, then stopped, and started again, then stopped again. Finally, he let out a very frustrated sigh and gave us directions to an Imperial world whose governor had just purchased the Archaeotech. The Eldar then told us to get off his shuttle before he orders his ship to disengage and let the heretics have the system, data records and all. Sarge took a second to ponder this last part of the deal, and asked Tink how things were going. From up in the cockpit, Tink announced, for the 20th time, that he'd figured out the controls and would be able to fly us away before anyone could stop us. He triumphantly pressed a few buttons, flipped a switch, and manually connected 2 wires. Once again, the shuttle completely failed to move, and the lights flicked off, then back on. Sarge told the Warlock he could have his shuttle back. Twitch packed up his toys. Fumbles was given a less dangerous pack to use as a helmet. Tink was forcefully pulled out of the cockpit, and Nubby was told to empty his pockets. While everyone else packed up, Sarge and Amy debated the whole tech priest problem. It was eventually decided that there was no way to really hide the Archaeotech's location from them. Luckily, Amy was able to suggest a way to keep the Cogboys on our side for the time being. Jim was called to pick us up, and over the monitored channel, Sarge reported the location of the Archaeotech. He also warned everyone that a sizable Heretech fleet was being gathered to seize it before the Mechanicus could confiscate it. So maybe we should try to get there and secure it first. It wasn't very subtle, but hey, neither were we. And the Cogboys must have bought it because everyone's shuttles picked them up without any arguing or ultimatums. Everyone was feeling pretty happy about how the mission had went as we left the Eldar shuttle. In a fit of goodwill, Tink even pushed the fish head's limbs into a neat pile and left a note saying which way the second one had been drifting when we'd last seen it. As Jim and Hannah flew us back to the Occurrence border, we looked back at the station we'd never gotten around to boarding. It was looking rather ragged. Its interior probably hadn't been designed to survive pitched fights involving anti-armor energy weaponry, and the star behind it had gotten noticeably larger. We congratulated ourselves on not being stupid enough to board that death trap, and watched the station shrink behind us. Right as it was getting too small to see anymore, there was a neat little fireworks display. We couldn't be sure, but the explosion seemed to match the locations of all the Heretech shuttles. That probably explained what the Eldar had been up to. Our good moods lasted until Jim landed us in the Occurrence Border's main shuttle bay. We were the last team back, and the bay was a madhouse full of rushing people and horrible screams. Doc and his girlfriend were running around with their medical teams. From the look of it, they had quite a few customers, and Sarge detailed a few of us to lend a hand. Surprisingly, most of the screams weren't coming from Doc's patients. What had at first looked and sounded like a field surgery station turned out to be something weirder. Half a dozen of the senior Cogboys were clustered together in a far corner of the bay. As we watched, a captive Heretech was brought off a shuttle by some servitors and dragged into the group of tech priests. There were some very unsettling power tool noises and a lot more screams, and Sarge asked Jim and Hannah what was going on. The 2 engine seers whispered to each other for a while, then said the tech priests were checking the captives for serial numbers. Apparently, they could be used to determine which cabal the Heretechs had come from. From there, the tech priests would research past records of the sort of technology the Heretechs had access to, giving us a major advantage when it came time to fight their fleet. Sarge pondered the fact that there wasn't actually any Heretech fleet. He then weighed that against how the screams seemed to indicate that the Cogboys didn't believe in little things like sedation or killing people before dissecting them. In the end, he decided that this was not his problem, and he really needed a drink, or at least some painkillers for his shoulders. Better yet, a drink and some painkillers, and someone to take off his void suit without him having to move his arms. In the end, he had to settle for just the painkillers. Everything else had to wait until after he talked with the captain, adepts, other interrogators, and whoever the tech priest sent to vaguely threaten everyone. Sarge returned to our quarters hours later, looking like shit and still wearing his void suit. Our first few tries to remove his suit resulted in a lot of yelling and Nubby getting punted across the room. In the end, Tink wound up just cutting him out while Amy held the bottle of liquor with a straw in it for him. The gist of the situation was that the Eldar ship had disengaged and vanished after the Heretech shuttles had been destroyed. The Heretech ship hadn't tried to chase us or catch up with the falling station. Instead, it had warped out shortly after the fight ended. The captain couldn't be sure, but it didn't look like it was heading in the same direction as us, and the scanners had been clear since we entered the warp ourselves. We were headed towards the coordinates the Eldar had given us, which turned out to be the planet with the shifty Governor Sword Guy had wanted us to go to. Sarge said the other interrogator had been rather bitter over the whole thing, mostly on account of how he'd been shot in the gut twice during the station fight. Battle Axe wasn't in great shape either. They'd shed a lot of blood fighting off the servitors and capturing 2 Heretechs for interrogation. Tensions were rather high due to the way the tech priests had seized those hard-won prisoners and vivisected them. The Cogboys were not very apologetic for this, but at least they'd shared their info on this particular group of Heretechs with the rest of us. The Adepts were chewing through it and would be putting together some combat plans and stuff like that during the trip. The other info Sarge had relayed from the Warlock hadn't gone over well. To start with, everyone but the tech priests had given Sarge grief for not getting the actual details of the Archaeotech from the Eldar. He'd very politely told them where they could shove their complaints, then moved on to the matter of who was probably purging planets. The revelation that it was Necrons chasing the Archaeotech, or at least that the Eldar said it was Necrons, had quieted everyone down. While it had been the smart bet in the pool ever since we'd learned this was all about a piece of Archaeotech, having it confirmed was fairly unpleasant. None of the other teams had fought them before, but between their training and the stories everyone had heard, they didn't need us to tell them that the Necrons were bad news. The captain had reiterated his suggestion that we go somewhere safe and request an entire fleet's worth of backup. Most of us thought that sounded like a great idea. Unfortunately, Sarge and the other interrogators thought otherwise. They believed that if we got there fast enough, we could do something to prevent Necrons from wiping out another planet and keep the Heretech fleet, which Sarge now regretted making up, from getting the Archaeotech. Of course, the exact details of what we'd do were still a bit fuzzy. The interrogators' only good ideas were to destroy the Archaeotech, or put it somewhere where the Necrons could take it without killing everyone. The tech priests had informed everyone that both those options would result in their grisly deaths. The most they'd allow would be for us to set up a perimeter around the Archaeotech and plant a bomb which the ship's head tech priest would build and hold the detonator for. All the interrogators, even Sarge, had wound up agreeing to this. The captain had called them idiots, and since Sarge wasn't in any condition to hit us at the moment, we all agreed. The one saving grace of the interrogators' plans was that, being on the border and all, the planet we were heading towards had a fair-sized PDF and SDF. Between that and the detailed intel we could provide, there was a slim chance that we could hold off the Necrons until reinforcements arrived, or the tech priests stopped being assholes. Emphasis on slim. Once again, we were stuck traveling through the warp, and hoping like hell we'd arrive before everything went ploin-shaped. At least this time, we had a better idea of what was currently happening at our destination. The planet had a branch of the Telepathica, and the Astropath was able to keep tabs on their situation. The Adepts and the other teams spent a lot of time sending messages back and forth, looking for clues about where the Archaeotech was, and all that. We didn't trouble ourselves with any of that. Someone would tell if they found something important. For the time being, we had other stuff to do. Aside from the usual planning bullshit that Sarge had to put up with, we were able to dedicate our full efforts to some very important projects. Okay, well, one important project, a less important minor one, and a bit of entrepreneuring. The less important one was replacing Sarge's lasgun. When the Xenos, which the Adepts had told us were called a Wraith Guard, not a fish head, had disarmed him, it had bent his lasgun like a banana. Since fruit-shaped weapons tend not to work well, and Amy's pulse rifle had performed so awesomely, Tink put all his effort into converting a Tau carbine for Sarge's use. Everyone else was moderately jealous. The other side project was, of course, Nubby's continual quest to not lose quite a bit of money in the betting pool. Fumbles revealed to the rest of us that during our last bit of travel time, they'd tracked down the only 3 people who'd bet on the Necrons. Then persuaded them to retract those bets. All that was left was to convince the ship's quartermaster, who was the one actually holding the money and tracking the bets, to allow the withdrawal. Once that was done, there'd be no winning bets, and the money would surely default back to everyone. We left Nubby to his little plot, which seemed to revolve around getting some incriminating pictures of the quartermaster. We'd be getting our money back too, after all. So aside from that little stuff, all of our effort was put into the big important project. Operation Screw Everyone Else Over Before They Screw Us. Now, this may sound like the default state we operated in, but this was a much more concerted effort than our usual paranoia and misanthropy. Our focus was almost entirely on 2 parties, the Tech Priests and the Warlock. Now, it's obvious why we felt the need to plot against the Cogboys, with them acting nuttier than squirrel shit and all. But the Eldar part might need some explanation. See, it is in the very nature of Eldar to dick honest, hard-working guardsmen over. They probably tell each other stories of great Eldar heroes who use their magical Xenos powers for absolutely nothing but being a colossal dick. Based on this single concrete fact about his basic nature, we knew that the Warlock would A. show up at the planet, B. try to use us to destroy the Archaeotech, C. proceed to dick us over as hard as he possibly could the second we were no longer useful. This may be a lot to infer from a single piece of racism, but it was backed up by our personal experience with the Warlock. When we'd been talking with him over the Hollow-What's-It, we'd gotten the distinct impression that he didn't like us for some reason. That was a sure sign of a dickish personality. Anyway, the project was mostly prep work, and the first step was securing allies. Jim and Hannah had been decent to us, but that whole thing about possibly following orders to leave us to die was bad and needed fixing. To that end, both Jim and Hannah were invited down to our quarters, then locked in and treated to a class on ethics by our resident expert, Nubby. Don't laugh. This wasn't a class on those sissy, do unto others as you would have them do unto you ethics. This was a class on Guardsmen ethics, which tend to only go as far as do unto others, and Nubby knew those by heart. He and Doc, as you might recall the friendliest and most persuasive members of our little group, were assisted by the ever-loyal Fumbles in teaching Camaraderie 101 to Jim and Hannah. The 2 junior tech priests were educated in why it is important to stick with your mates, when and when not to follow the rules and regs, why you should never trust anyone over the rank of sergeant. They also got a special bonus course on why killing your close personal friends because a crazy priest told you to is a very bad thing. By the end, both engineers were thinking like proper guardsmen and gave us all the vital information we needed for the rest of our project. Specifically, how the tech priests would probably monitor us, what sort of bomb they'd be giving us to plant, and where it and its detonator were being built. From there, it was Twitch and Tink's show.